Noitu Love 2 is a game I played a couple of years ago that immediately became one of my favourites. Putting aside the novel control scheme, it was more so the pacing, the variety, the boss fights, the visuals, the creativity, and the charm that really got to me. While you had all these cool player mechanics, the game never dwelled on them. It was always throwing you into new scenarios to fight new enemies under new circumstances, interspersed with tons of unique boss fights. It was consistently fun and unpredictable throughout its short runtime. So, of course, I then played the developer Konjak's following release, and while I wasn't by any means expecting Noitu Love 3, I was expecting the strengths the developer had showcased in game design to show themselves again, but on the whole they really didn't. Iconoclasts is a 11 or so hour long platformer with this much cutscene. Now, considering how much of this game's runtime is dedicated to its storytelling, you may be rightfully expecting some sort of breakdown or critique of the narrative, but unfortunately, I can't read, so I won't be engaging with it. Instead, I'll just say that its combinations of themes, tone, character arcs, pacing, it all leads to it having a rather niche appeal that I wouldn't expect to act as the hook for most audiences. In which case, it'd fall back on its gameplay. One might assume that in between all of the long, frequent cutscenes, you'd be running around, jumping over obstacles and shooting things, and while this is part of the gameplay, a bizarrely large portion of the game is made up of puzzle rooms, designed around placing bombs and moving boxes around in order to navigate a linear series of small maps. These puzzles aren't exactly engaging tests of intellect either, yet you'll be spending as much time on them, if not more, than you will on platforming. There's one area in particular in the middle of the game that consists mostly of just going up and down elevators and crawling through vents and placing bombs for a solid, hour. You barely interact with the core mechanics at all. Okay, but what are these mechanics? Well, you've got jumping, shooting, and robbing. Your core moveset never really evolves movement-wise, the genre staples of upgrades instead being relegated to having situational or contextual usages, primarily for puzzle solving. The second best mechanic is your charge shot, because of its versatility. In combat, it's strong but balanced by having a long cooldown and lacking the reach of your normal homing shots. And outside of combat, it can work as a double jump or even a speed boost via its recoil. You could probably design some really fun platforming challenges around the existing properties of the charge shot and the ground pound, because when ground pounding into slopes, you get a lot of momentum. But the level design is far more occupied with presenting puzzles than platforming challenges. As for the shooting action, your homing shots eliminate the need for aiming but are super weak, meaning everything you can shoot down feels way too tanky, and everything you can't requires you to just stand there and wait for an attack that you can reflect. As a result, the few dedicated combat sections against enemies are not the exciting run and gun I would have expected from the developer of Noitu Love 2, or even Legend of Princess. But you know what? Doesn't matter. Rather than judge Iconoclast as some sort of platformer or action game, let's judge it as a Metroidvania. After all, the Metroidvania genre isn't known for having the most intense platforming or action, it's known for having a really stupid name, but also for its non-linear exploration and satisfying progression systems. They often get away with being a slower burn and having more simplistic moment-to-moment gameplay by offering these alternative appeals. Problem with that is that Iconoclast doesn't really have those either, and that's where things get interesting. Its story has a traditional linear narrative structure told through a series of scenes that need to be played in order, but this type of narrative structure is antithetical to non-linear exploration. What you'll find is that the more linearly a game's story needs to be told, and of course the more focus placed on it, the less freedom the player has in their progression. Meaning in Iconoclast's case, every player will be going through the same series of areas, picking up the same upgrades in the same order every time, with the only exploration or backtracking to be found in hunting down collectibles, which themselves are largely unrewarding, since instead of granting permanent upgrades and imbuing a sense of character improvement, you instead get crafting materials, which you need a lot of to make a limited amount of minor, generic changes to your character. It did not surprise me at all to learn that these tweaks were added relatively late into the game's design, with how little of an effect they have on it. You could play a version of this game where the tweaks had zero functionality whatsoever, and it'd barely be noticeable. So, if the exploration and the progression systems are limited, the core mechanics are underutilized, the gameplay is uninteresting and unengaging, the pacing is slow, why do I care about this game? Well, it's very simple. The boss fights. The boss fights are where the game finally comes together. The story works with the gameplay rather than against it by giving the encounters some narrative weight, and the developer's unparalleled sprite work can be used on putting on a spectacle rather than just background art and cutscenes. It's not like the fights are incredibly complex or challenging, but they're just good and fun and creative. Let's be honest, even the few Metroidvanias with good boss fights usually boil down to just dodging the attacks, getting the hits in, rinse repeat. But in Iconoclasts, they tend to have some sort of trick or weakness beyond just shooting them, without resorting to being pure gimmick fights. A lot of them even manage to work in your normally non-existent party members, and in doing so manage to demonstrate the power of teamwork far more than any amount of dialogue could insist. And the tenuous progression system now works in the game's favour. Since your character can't be over or underpowered, the challenge is fixed to how the developer intends, unlike in something like Metroid where your health can vary anywhere between 99 and 1999. Now the bosses aren't perfect. My main critique is that most of them are too straightforward and easy to make refighting them engaging. On a first go round, they telegraph their weaknesses well and are balanced around figuring it out, but once you do, they lose a lot of their challenge. Ideally, the higher difficulties wouldn't just increase their damage, but make them harder to dodge and punish, with a lot more chaotic elements thrown in to keep you busy. But that aside, I can't stress how much better the boss fights are compared to the rest of the gameplay. It was only when I was fighting the bosses that I saw what I saw in Noitu Love 2, and that I was reminded how skilled this developer really was. So clearly, the dev's strengths lie in action gameplay, and Iconoclasts would have been better off if it had been designed as an arcadey run and gun rather than a compromised Metroidvania. But hold on, I said earlier that there are stretches of the game where you do just fight enemies and they're still not very fun or engaging. What's up with that? Has the developer just lost his touch with action design outside of boss fights? Well, I was specifically talking about the parts where you play as Robin, who, as we all know, uses a stun gun. So of course she's not designed around actually gunning people down. But there is a part of the game where you play as Mina, the chick with the actual gun. Alright, yes, here we go. Now we're gaming. We're getting some proper action. Hold on. The story's getting in the way. Hold on. Let it play out. Okay. Okay, we're back. Alright, let's go. Let's do this. Just gunning people down. Back-to-back action. No breaks. No puzzles. You got a cool boss fight. And then, oh, there's even a bullet time segment out of nowhere. And then it's over. And then it's over, and you're back to throwing boxes around. Great. But hey, at the end of the game, you get to play as Mina again. And then you quickly find out it's an auto-scroller where you're stuck on a platform the entire time. And you're like, this sucks. But then, right on cue, you get a really fun boss fight, and you're like, alright, we're back. And then...
Meanwhile...
Why are the parts where you don't play as Robin the best parts? I don't get it. Okay, so clearly the dev still has the capabilities to make a great action game. But while the Misadventures of Mina would be a very fun game, it'd also be quite brief. That's the nature of linear 2D action games. If you drag them out, they get repetitive and tiring. You can't keep up that kind of fast, consistent pace without either exhausting the game mechanics or the player. Which is fine, since they're designed around replayability. Metroidvanias, on the other hand, slow the pace down by offering exploration and backtracking instead. Now, Iconoclasts already has pacing issues because of its story. The cutscenes are very lengthy and very plentiful. If you were to trim the fat from the gameplay, the proportion of time spent playing the game and reading the story would become absurd. It would be a VN with a game attached to it, which, I mean, I wouldn't have a problem with. I love watching Royal do his stuff. I love Agent Black, I love Elro, I love a lot of these characters, but it would be absurd. So, okay, the story's getting in the way, we'll just ditch the story. Well, no, the game is clearly a vessel to tell this story in the first place. Being a solo passion project, it must have been important to the developer as a storyteller. But this is the crux of the issue. The game needed to be linear to tell this type of story, but also adopt more Metroidvania-esque level design to pad itself out, which in turn is hampered by the need to be linear in the first place. Additionally, the dev's strengths in action game design wasn't able to serve the needs of a slower paced game. From my point of view, this game's goals were irreconcilable. Moving forward, is there a way to have a purely action-focused game that also has a heavy focus on narrative without either goal getting in the way? I think so. And I'm not talking about environmental storytelling, I mean explicit storytelling. Well, the simplest way is just to have the characters chatter on over the gameplay. One of my favourite games is Kid Icarus Uprising, whose runtime consists almost entirely of core gameplay, but it still gets in a lot of storytelling and characterization by having the characters just talk over the game. But that's enabled by the fact that it's basically a cartoon and not trying to tell any sort of complex or serious story. I can't imagine trying to get across themes and subject matter of oppression, revenge, societal expectation, all while the player is busy stomping turrets, especially through text. Okay, so to tell certain stories you need to take a break from the action, but can you do that without hurting the pacing? Yeah, I'd say so. simply have the player choose to partake in the story whenever they feel so inclined. I think this sort of hands-off approach to storytelling is what a game like Hades should be recognized for in particular. Roguelites are entirely gameplay, but they can leverage their meta progression to tell a narrative across several runs at the player's leisure, so you get the benefit of having the time to let your story tell itself without getting in the player's way. Although this type of repetitious story structure requires a very contrived premise to justify itself, which again limits its application. Now, am I saying Iconoclasts should have been some sort of run-and-gun roguelite in order to leverage the dev's strengths in action game design to create a more condensed experience in a format audiences accept as having short runtimes while leaving room to fulfill narrative ambition? No, of course not. But I think that's what Konjak's next game is going to be.
Lucky there's a family guy coming to save you.